And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to look at a summary of aggregate demand problems and aggregate supply problems, and we're going to focus on the short run on this discussion. But keep in mind, there's always the long run. I don't have it here, but there's the long run aggregate supply curve, and that means that whenever we have a problem, one possible solution is do nothing and allow the economy to naturally return to the long run aggregate supply curve. So I just want to highlight that and say that's really important, and as a possible policy solution to do nothing. But right now we're going to focus on the do something solutions in the short run. We're going to focus on the do something solutions in the short run. So let's look at the aggregate demand problems first. So there are two possible aggregate demand problems. One of them is the aggregate demand curve shifting into left. Now, let's remember this. When the aggregate demand curve shifts into left, like in the real world, you're an economist studying the world, you can't actually see aggregate demand curves. You can't go like, oh, there's an aggregate demand curve shift to the left. I guess we got to go fix that. You can't see that happening. It's an abstraction that we use to understand the world. So what do we actually see happen? What we actually do see happen is we could look at data and we could see if prices and gross domestic product are going down at the same time. The only way that can happen is if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. That's how we identify that we have an aggregate demand problem, that GDP and prices are both going down at the same time. Now, if that happens, what the problem actually is that you have a decrease in the gross domestic product, which we call a recession. But it's important to note what type of recession it is. It's an aggregate demand caused recession, and I know that because the decrease in the GDP is matched up with a decrease in the price level. So if we have an aggregate demand problem, the argument would be that we need an aggregate demand solution. What are aggregate demand solutions? Well, one of them is the Keynesian response, and that would be the expansionary fiscal policy, where we're going to increase government spending and cut taxes in order to shift that aggregate demand curve back to the right. Problem solved. The second possible demand side solution is monetary policy. You could use monetary policy. And the monetary policy here would be that the Federal Reserve, you can watch how this works on another one of my previous videos, but the Federal Reserve would go out there and they would begin to buy bonds. And if the Federal Reserve goes out there and buys bonds, then people will give their bonds to the Federal Reserve, who is buying them, and the Federal Reserve will pay you for those bonds or pay banks for those bonds, and that will increase the money supply and lower interest rates, and that will all cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Either way, that these are aggregate demand solutions. They are aggregate demand solutions to an aggregate demand problem, the aggregate demand curve shifting into left. Now, what's the second thing that could happen? The second problem that we could have is if the aggregate demand curve shifts out too far to the right. If the aggregate demand curve shifts out too far to the right, remembering there's a long run aggregate supply curve in here somewhere, and if the aggregate demand curve shifts out too far to the right and the economy actually grows too fast, well, then what we'll see in the data is we'll see increase in GDP and increase in inflation. Now, why did I say the economy grows too fast? Because obviously the economy growing fast in and of itself, like that's not a problem. GDP is growing, unemployment's going down. This is all great. So what's the problem? Well, the problem here would be the increase in the prices. The increase in the prices is what would be the problem. So if we get an increase in prices, that of course is inflation. So now we have an inflation problem. So how are we going to solve this inflation problem? Well, there's always the classical solution, do nothing and let the economy go and, all that sort of thing. But we want to look at if there's an aggregate demand problem in the short run, what are the aggregate demand solutions? Well, the first one would be the Keynesian solution, which would be contractionary fiscal policy, and that would be the cutting government spending, increasing taxes to shift that aggregate demand curve back into left, or monetary policy solution. You could use monetary policy. And in this case, with the monetary policy, you would have the Federal Reserve is now going to sell bonds. the Federal Reserve is going to sell bonds, and when they sell bonds, people will give money to the Fed in return for bonds. That's going to raise interest rates, decrease investment and consumption. Aggregate demand is going to shift into the left. Again, you can watch an older video on how that works. So these would be the aggregate demand solutions. These would be the aggregate demand solutions to the aggregate demand problem of inflation. How do I know it was an aggregate demand inflation problem? Because when prices went up, the GDP was also going up. That's how I knew that it was an aggregate demand problem. Now, let's look at the aggregate supply side. What's an aggregate supply problem? Well, the aggregate supply problem would be if the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted into the left. Okay, again, we can't actually see this in the real world. You can't see supply curves in the real world. And so how would we know that we have a supply side problem? Well, we would know because we would see prices going up and GDP going down at the same time. And so this would be, this short-run aggregate supply problem, this would be if the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted to the left. If it shifts to the left, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to get, you're going to have two problems actually at once. You're going to have higher prices, which is obviously inflation. You're going to have higher prices, which is inflation. And you're also going to have lower GDP, and that means that we have a recession. That means that we have a recession. All right, so we have both of these at the same time, which, by the way, on previous podcasts, we said the name of that is stagflation. We have stagflation. We have stagflation. And so when we have stagflation, now when you get a decrease in the gross domestic product and an increase in prices, you have a recession and inflation at the same time, you have an aggregate demand an aggregate supply problem. You don't want to use aggregate demand solutions. So you can't come in as a Keynesian to solve this problem. You can't even really come in with monetary policy isn't really going to ultimately solve this problem satisfactorily. So what do you need instead? Now you need a classical solution. So now you're going to need a classical solution to the problem. We have an aggregate supply problem. We need an aggregate supply solution. So now we need a classical response. And what is the classical response? Well, the classical response is kind of twofold. It's kind of going to say the same thing all the time, and that is cut taxes, and deregulate. Now, let's remember what cutting taxes means from the classical point of view. Cutting taxes, we're not cutting taxes here to shift the aggregate demand curve. That's really, really important. We're not cutting taxes to shift the aggregate demand curve. We are cutting I talked about this in a previous video as well. We are cutting taxes to encourage people to work. If you cut taxes, then people will invest more, they will work more, and they have a greater incentive to work because they get to keep more of what they earn. So if you cut taxes, that will encourage work, and in this argument, it will actually cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift. Not the aggregate demand curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve. The aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. And actually, if I had the long-run aggregate supply curve on here, that would be shifting to the right as well when you cut taxes and encourage work. And then the other is deregulate. Regulations are costly for businesses. The rules that businesses have to follow, those are costly. So deregulate. Get those rules out of the way. Get government off the back of businesses. Deregulate, cut their taxes, and let the economy grow. That would be the argument, and that would just shift that short and aggregate supply curve back out to the right. Problem solved. So an aggregate supply problem, one could argue that an aggregate supply problem requires an aggregate supply solution, which is the classical response. That's the classical solution. All right, so that's what we would do in response to an aggregate supply problem. Again, the key to this discussion is how do we know whether we have an aggregate demand or aggregate supply problem? Well, you have to look at whether or not GDP and prices moved together or whether they moved in the opposite direction. That's the key. If prices and GDP both go down, aggregate demand problem. If they both go up, aggregate demand problem. But if prices go up and GDP goes down, then it's an aggregate supply problem. And you might be saying, well, Hagen, we're missing one. What happens if the short and aggregate supply curve shifts to the right? Well, that's not a problem. If the short and aggregate supply curve were to shift out to the right, then no problem there. Why not? Because if the short and aggregate supply curve shifts out to the right, we're going to get lower prices and higher GDP. That's not a problem. There's no problem to go solve there. That's not a problem. So so we have three problems, aggregate demand problems, that two of them that require aggregate demand solutions, aggregate supply problems that require aggregate supply solutions. So let's just put this in historical context. The historical context to this would be, an example of this would be in history, would be, this would be maybe like the 1930s. In 1930s, we saw very deep recessions, and we saw prices going down. Okay, we had disinflation, we had deflation in 1930s. And so in 1930s, we had an aggregate demand problem. That's what the data said. And so the Keynesians would say we obviously need an aggregate demand solution. And then over here, this is indicative of what happened in the 1970s. In 1970s, we had stagflation, and so the Keynesian solutions really weren't getting the job done. What we needed was an aggregate supply solution, which was cutting taxes and deregulating. So it might be, I'm not sure if this is true, but it might be that both sides have a point, the Keynesian and the classical economists, and it just kind of depends on who's right, depends on the particular circumstances. Maybe in the 30s the Keynesians were right, we had an aggregate demand problem, and maybe in the 70s we had a classical problem, an aggregate supply problem, and we need a classical solution. So maybe that's all true. All right, this has been Mr. Hagen, another podcast trying to kind of summarize everything. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you again on the next podcast.